a dire forecast, and we then had Moody's reduce its outlook. Thankfully, the Springboks saved the week, so we ended on a high note. But given the context of what we heard last week on the nation's financial picture, I'd like you to start with the investment case for South Africa. Why invest deeper in the country, and why do it now?
Thank you very much, Sean. Is my speaker on?
Try it again.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Now we can.
All right. Thank you very much. So I think certainly from a South African perspective, what we see is that notwithstanding the challenges that we have as a country, and having heard the medium-term budget speech just in the last few days, we know that notwithstanding that, there are certainly a number of opportunities, and we see that. Last year, having committed the 4.6 billion rand, following the President's conference that we had, just as we are having now today, we have seen a significant amount of businesses that we were able to support. So out of that 4.6 billion rand, we had committed 3.2 billion rand towards our existing businesses, and then we had put aside 1.4 billion rand towards the Foundry. The Foundry is an entity where we're investing into new internet-based businesses, consumer internet businesses. And it has been astounding to see the number of businesses, new businesses, that are available for us to invest in. And it has been wonderful to be able to do so. And so the first business that we invested in was a business called Sweep South, where we invested 30 million rand. And they are employing a significant number of domestic cleaners around the country. And, you know, it just shows just the amount of opportunities that are available in South Africa. And so we continue to be very, very focused on growing in South Africa and continuing to make sure that we are there to support investment in South Africa, certainly in the consumer internet businesses, as we are a consumer internet business ourselves. But over and above that, the challenge that we see is largely on the regulatory side. So over and above the 4.6 billion rand that we had committed, we were ready to invest further into another business. But I'm sure that as, you know, I'm looking at the President as you know, we are looking, I'm sure as they're looking at the regulations around Competition Commission and all of that, that some of these will be looked at in terms of the internet-based businesses, you know, so that we can allow for businesses to be able to invest. We are invested in India, Russia, Brazil, around the world, and our focus, though, is on being able to support South African businesses. But we can only invest when we are able to do so in terms of the regulatory environment. And so that is something that is very important for us to be able to do so.
And thanks for that, Puti.
Yeah.
We will get back to both the regulation question and the new businesses question, but first let me, Mark, turn to you. Puti gave her sort of update on the pledges of the investment last year. Could you do the same? Because last year, Anglo-American, I think, pledged $6 billion to be spent here in South Africa on its mines over 4 years. Could you give us just a sense of how that's tracking?
Sure. First, if I could make one comment. The President talked about noise. And there is no doubt that South Africa has a vibrant economy, political environment. But remember, all countries have their moments. And from the UK at the moment, where I live, a thing called Brexit doesn't make the world an easy place. You've got the US going through its own trials and tribulations politically, and you've got Australia trying to deal with the tragedy of the rugby. So we all have our moments, and we must remember that each has its own challenges. In South Africa,
we know a bit about that in the United States, where
exactly.
I come from too.
So, in terms of our commitments, in the last 12 months, as the Minister outlined, we've spent about 15 billion rand on projects across the country. Number one, Venetia, our diamond mine, we're transferring from an open cut operation to a new underground operation. That in of itself is the single largest new development in a mining operation in the last 20 years in South Africa. So that's a significant commitment to the country over the next 10 to 20 years. We have incremental projects, new debottlenecking projects in our iron ore operations in Kumba. In our PGM operations, or platinum operations, we are modernising our deep underground operations at Amandelbult. We have committed to feasibility studies on the expansion of our Mahanyele-Dabengwa open cut operation. We've partnered with the PIC, one of our most significant pension funding groups, in new technologies in platinum, called the Platinum Venture Funds, around 3 billion rand together in new technologies and uses for cheap PGMs. We're committed to long-term development in manganese, and from our point of view, we've been investing in life extensions in our thermal coal assets. So right across the entire spectrum, we're investing in new opportunities, growth, and for the future. And with Anglo American representing 40% of South Africa's mining industry, that's a significant commitment in an industry that we believe has a great future and certainly has been a big part of South Africa's past.
Thanks for that. Rob, MTN is known as a large investor in its business across the continent. Obviously, we're here to talk about investment in South Africa specifically. Can you give us some sense of, what are the major investments that MTN is either involved in or contemplating here in South Africa? And ultimately, I know you'll want to talk about 4IR and some of the new businesses, and we'll get to that as well.
Yeah, thanks very much. I guess for MTN in South Africa, we really have two facets to that. One is that we run the multinational operation from South Africa. So that's across our 21 markets, 17 in Africa, 4 in the Middle East. And that, I think, is very much affirmation of what the President was saying earlier, that South Africa is a great base for multinationals looking to access the African continent. We have the best infrastructure, we have great skills. A small example of that, we had our group technology team based in Dubai for many years. We relocated them back to South Africa in 2018, and we found all the skills we needed to run, obviously, a very complex technology area. So that's the first part. Then the second part, of course, is the MTN mobile operation in South Africa. Mm-hmm. And there, we're very much still believers that South Africa has all the potential to be a high-growth emerging market economy. The reality over the last 10 years is that the GDP growth rate has been lower than actually many developed countries. So one of South Africa's challenges has been we've been perceived as being higher risk because we're a developing economy, but we weren't delivering the growth. But all of the basics that are needed for much stronger GDP growth are here. Mm-hmm. We have what we call the demographic dividend, youthful populations, low-level adoption of digital services, good infrastructure, an infrastructure that is the envy of many of the other markets, that we operate in. And we really believe that as we get on top of, addressing, some of the more fundamental challenges we've got as an economy, that the growth will come through. And of course, what that means for an industry like ours is that we have to invest particularly in data and digital technologies. South Africa is really just about 1/3 of the way through the adoption of the internet or the mobile internet. In the MTN base, it's around about 40% of our customers. Utilization is low. So there is an avalanche of data traffic that's going to come onto these mobile networks, particularly also as the economy improves. And we are going to need to really invest in that to harness that. And then, of course, we also want to participate in the digital solutions that are running on top of those networks. Mm-hmm. That's another big investment focus of ours.
Well, thank you for that, because you've given a perfect segue to Teresa Carlson at Amazon Web Services, speaking of digital and data. And Teresa, compared to some of the other companies represented here, Amazon Web Services is a relative newcomer to South Africa, but in our research, we found out that you've actually been here for 15 years, which is not a short amount of time.
Correct.
And AWS is established in Cape Town and appears to be growing there. Can you give us some sense of the scope of the operation of Amazon Web Services and where you see opportunity throughout South Africa?
Yeah. Well, you're right. This is a great segue. It's fantastic to be here. We were actually here last year. And when we were here last year, we said and we committed that we were going to build a hyperscale cloud computing region here in South Africa. And the good news is we're scheduled to launch that by the first half of 2020. So everything that we've been talking about here is really it can be realized through cloud computing. And this is not just a data center. Our commitment is quite large to South Africa, and the continent. We're basing our first cloud region here. And for us, what that means is we come in and we build 3 availability zones. So this is a quite large area that has multiple data centers. We use telecommunications, utilities, networking. We have to create a lot of jobs. So this is a very long-term commitment to South Africa and the continent. And for us, South Africa is not new. Like you said, we actually, in 2004 in Cape Town, we brought developers and engineers here to create our flagship tool, which is called EC2, which is our compute, which is today still our largest service that we have at Amazon Web Service. So it's really exciting for us, and I think when you get into the digital skills and the capabilities, everything that we were talking about here, cloud computing is going to be a major catalyst to driving that next digital revolution here. And you really need today, in order to achieve the capabilities of what we've been talking about, cloud computing is essential. And in this country and for the continent to be able to take advantage of technologies and build on this. And what we see around the world when AWS goes into a region, we don't just show up. We pull in many other partners and we help create new entrepreneurs. So if you can imagine large companies around the world that you think of, Uber, Airbnb, Spotify, Pinterest, Netflix, they all run on AWS, including our own retail family, which is all based on cloud computing. So we're very excited to be here, and this investment is a long-term investment for us. We think hard and we work very closely with the government when we come into any region around the world. And it's important to have that partnership, and we have really felt that here. So now we're actually just, I'll say, coming back home in a bigger way to expand what we're actually already doing here in South Africa.
I'm tempted to stick on this. I'm tempted to stick on this topic of new businesses, but first let me bring in the notion of what President Ramaphosa just spoke about reducing red tape and some of the regulation around it, because that might indeed generate and be a catalyst to some of this new business, spectrum, for example. So let's just first take a look through the regulatory sphere. Phuthi, when you think of sort of regulation and what might be hampering investment, what does that mean for NASPERS?
Well, certainly, I think it comes back to the issue that I raised earlier. What we see is that, the consumer internet space, clearly it's a new industry, well, relatively new. And, I suppose regulations are still being developed. But what we see in other environments that we're invested in is that it's very easy to invest in some of those environments. And so it makes it difficult when you are not able to invest because of regulation. And particularly in a situation where the business that you are looking to acquire and scale up is keen for that. So this is something that's really critical. And then, coming over to what you were saying on the telecom side as well, it is so important. I think the statement that was made by the president is just so important in terms of opening up the ability for business to be able to invest further in the industry, so that we can see more scaling up in the telecoms industry and in other industries as well. But certainly in the consumer internet industry, that is the difficulty for us. We want to invest. We want to acquire businesses. We want to expand them into other regions that we currently are in. I mean, currently, as we sit now, we service 1.5 billion people per month as NASPERS around the world. And we would like to be able to do that significantly in South Africa. Now, in South Africa, we've got our e-tail business with our Take-A-Lot business and other businesses. We also have other businesses that we have as well here. But it's, we want to be able to do more, to acquire more businesses, to expand. And we just need to make sure that the regulatory environment is working with us so that we can invest and be able to achieve that.
And some of the initiatives that the President just spoke about, is it safe to say that you see some progress being made?
Well, we look forward to seeing that, as we are doing the transactions. So, as I mentioned, that we had, made a commitment of the 4.6 billion rand, but as a result of another transaction that we were looking to do, we were going to actually be committing a lot more. But, what we hope is that this will result in changes in some of the regulatory issues. And I say this knowing that South Africa has one of the most advanced regulatory environments in the world. But it's just a matter of just dealing with some of these issues on the internet, the consumer internet space. Yeah.
Now, Mark, I know this is a topic. Please, Teresa, go ahead.
Told us to do that, so I just wanted to say also, the regulatory environment is super important. When you're trying to drive digital transformation, you have to keep up because you can't let regulation get behind. That can really stagnate, actually, economy and growth. And what we kind of see is if you think about a startup economy, you want to have a model that actually encourages growth from everything from a small company. So if you over-regulate things, then you'll stomp out innovation with small kinds of startups who can't afford to do all that in a very fast pace. So you got to have a model that allows quick innovation. But at the same time as digital innovation occurs, you also need an environment that allows the process to move and flow and have an openness. And it's actually one of the things that we find when we go around the world, that we have to spend some quality time with all the regulators explaining what's changed, right, with technology and why they have to apply that to their thinking and in kind of everything they're doing, everything from farming to healthcare, agribusiness overall, telecommunications. Why all those things have to be looked at in a new way. And I see the thing that I've noticed here in South Africa is they're so open, they want to know and understand and figure out how they move those policies along so that businesses can flow. And I think that's a really important component of just allowing innovation to shape and happen.
Absolutely. Mark, I know this is a topic that you've spoken about publicly very recently. Could you give us your sense of what you'd like to see change in the regulatory landscape?
Yeah. First thing I should say, and just to set a little bit of context, our organisation's been through a major restructuring in the last 5 years. And today in South Africa, we have a group of operations, our companies are amongst the most productive in the world. They are amongst the most cost competitive in the world. And in fact, South Africa is our best jurisdiction in terms of unit operating costs, which does reflect the quality of the assets, but it also reflects the quality of the people, and in particular, how we've been able to work with the regulators in making changes to the business. And they've been tough changes, but we've had a voice that's understood the problems we've had. The country does understand our industry. We've been here for a lot of years, 102 years, and we've been able to navigate a different pathway. We still have a lot more work to do. And if I stand up today, I can't say the regulation is where we want it to be, but it's come a tremendous way in the last few years. Still got a way to go. We need security of tenure. We need the ability to be flexible with our workforce, and that's what we have been able to do and achieve in the last few years. And we need to think differently about how we can partner with the government, with our communities in a very different way. And so through our Zimeli work, we've created 57,000 new and sustainable jobs in terms of our community and small entrepreneur programs. We've also worked with communities to try and understand what we can do with infrastructure beyond the mine gate, because when we build a mine, We bring energy, we bring water, we bring roads, we bring infrastructure, and we haven't been thinking about how we can use those investments to support the community, do what they think is important, not what we think they should think is important, but what they believe is important. And in changing our mindset and working with the government, I think we're finding new ways to build the regulation so that it's dynamic, it's focused on what's good for the greater good, and how we work with new technologies and new companies that want to come into the country in a very different way to create new jobs and new opportunities for the long term. And I think that whole mosaic has to be painted, that picture has to be painted by all of us in this room in one way or the other. And it's about partnerships. And I think that's the most exciting thing about us being all here today together.
So staying with regulation or deregulation for a little bit longer, and then we can take that into new business opportunities as well. But Rob, I know spectrum obviously is going to be sort of uppermost on your mind, but can you talk about, what are the benefits, what sort of regulatory changes would you like to see freeing up or accelerating the freeing up of spectrum perhaps? But also, what are the benefits that come to that, not just for MTN, but also, for the country?
Yeah, I wasn't at the dinner last night, but I think if I had been there, I would have been one of the ones jumping up and down with joy at the possibility or in anticipation of the freeing up of the spectrum. Yeah. And I think it's important maybe just for 1 or 2 minutes just to explain why it is so crucial for the industry. The thing with the radio frequencies, so for example, if you driving here this morning, you're listening to a radio station, 98.7. That is a station that is broadcasting on that particular frequency, and that frequency is then used for that radio station. Nobody else can use it. And in the mobile industry, we were all allocated sections of frequency almost 20 years ago. And running on those highways are the voice calls and the gigabytes today. And the reality is that those frequencies are almost full. And we are about to go into exponential growth in data traffic on these networks. You look at the MTN network alone, if roughly 40% of our customers today use roughly 1 gigabyte per month, that will be 2/3 or 80% in a few years' time, and using 3 or 4 gigabytes per month. So the traffic is going to grow 5 times, and the existing frequency bands are occupied. And if we don't free those bands up, we won't be able to accommodate the traffic, and it will put so much of a load on the investment in the networks. So many more towers will be required to be very inefficient. So I think the real point I wanted to get across, it's something that the industry goes on and on about. I even bore myself sometimes going on about spectrum. But we are just really getting to the crunch time now. In the European markets, 4G was largely rolled out on low-band spectrum 7 or 8 years ago. That spectrum is not yet allocated in the South African context. So I think that's the big issue. It will help accommodate the traffic, it will improve the economies, it will bring down the price, it will keep the capex under control, and it will give us a sustainable sector. And we have, I think, a great sector as it is today. That's sort of the macro regulatory question. But then I think also there's a bunch of, let's say, smaller regulatory issues, what I call more sort of friction regulation, that sometimes things are just more difficult than they should be. It was wonderful to hear the President talking about the steps, for example, to make it easier for business people to come, to make it easier for people to set up small businesses. In our industry, things like municipal approvals to roll out infrastructure, waybills, to lay fiber. So there's also a collection of smaller areas that I think, if they are properly tackled, will just make it easier to do business, easier to spend, easier to invest. I think that can make a big difference for the country.
Makes sense. Teresa, I'm going to come across the panel on this, but I'll start with Teresa. Teresa, you talked about job creation just a little while ago, and also in terms of some of the new technology, digital obviously being part of it. Could you talk a little more about that? Sort of how does that work? how do you take a new technology, turn it into a business, and how would that benefit? Obviously, job creation is sort of topic
Yeah.
number one here in South Africa. How is that working for AWS? And then I'd like to go down the panel and talk about new technologies and how that might create jobs.
Well, I'll go back to go forward a little bit. When AWS first started, actually in 2006, we were a garage startup out of Amazon, believe it or not. We were like our own little, we call it day one at Amazon, where we're always kind of creating and looking to create new businesses. And we did this because internally we felt we needed a new model. But when we created the first solution we did was a simple storage service, and then we did a compute instance. And what we found is that individual developers and startups were our first customers. And they were coming to AWS because they could get compute and storage on demand. We had free tiers, and they would pay only for what they were using. And so if you go to a startup today in Silicon Valley, they don't know any difference. They don't know any way to do anything but to use cloud. So it's kind of the new model that they've been using for a while. But when I go around the world, the number one thing I hear from customers everywhere is, can you help me with the skills I need? Because they're moving to the cloud so rapidly. We've created this new thing called cloud computing, but there's not enough talent out there yet. And in fact, we just did a search here locally, and there's about 1,500 jobs locally for cloud computing openings already in South Africa. 100 of those I noticed are Amazon Web Services. But it's been the number one skill and job on LinkedIn, cloud computing and distributed computing for the last 3 years. So when we go in, we have to have a partnership. So if we just showed up, it would not be doing our community, our customers, the government, or ourselves justice if we didn't put the right training into place. So we've done a few things. We have over 300 digital online courses that we do, and they're translated. And then for our on-site, we have a program called AWS Educate. And for children and students ages 14 and up, we provide credits, training, and we do badging. So we actually train the teachers how to do this program. We have communities where they talk together, and we badge the students. So they learn things like AI and machine learning. They'll learn virtual reality skills. So what we want them to do is create what we call pathways, so by the time that they're ready, they can maybe even work along the way. And then we have an academy where they can get certified and actually have an AWS certification, which this is not my numbers, but Forbes said about 2 years ago that the starting salary for those is about $125,000 a year out of school. So there's tons of jobs, and then we partner up with different groups and not-for-profits to provide training. Here in Africa, we've done some interesting things with groups like Digital Divide Data, where we go into the communities, do intensive training, and make sure they get certified, and then they have jobs. But I just met with a bunch of the universities here locally this week, where we have partnerships, and we want to do degreed programs with them in cloud computing, which we now have over 50 of those around the world. And that's actually when they walk out the door, they are degreed or certified in cloud computing, which then they can just have the skills immediately to start work. So it's a really important part of what we do is to partner up with our communities, with the local vocational schools, community colleges, or universities. But the thing that we've actually found is that we have to start earlier, because in the universities today, and I respectfully tell them this, they tend to teach more outdated skills in the computer science department. So we're trying to help them modernize by working backwards from the skills actually all these employers need. But the last thing I'll say that I think is actually pretty exciting is that I have to tell you, I meet young entrepreneurs around the world that have started and sold companies using cloud. I met a young girl in Brazil recently who was 22, who had already did a startup and sold her first gaming company, and was in her second and had 2 offers, and told me she created it on the free tier of AWS, her first one. And she was 16 or 17. But these are the kind of stories I think that are pretty exciting, because when you have access to technology and you're trained properly, you can really create something in your room, in your dorm room. That's how these things happen. And I believe here in Africa now, South Africa, and we're going to be able to do that a lot more. And we are going to be a good partner. I won't say that we have it totally figured out what the right approach is for Africa, so we need everybody's if you have ideas and feedback, because we want to make sure that we're providing the skills out into all the communities and villages in the right way, because we really have to touch everyone here. The population is so young. We don't want to miss these individuals.
Sure. Rob, anything on new technologies and how that leads to new jobs?
As I was saying earlier, big focus for us now going forward is also the digital services running on top of the technology. We've kicked off a project to build what we call African super app, so instant messaging platform particularly built for the African markets, Ayoba. So we're really excited about that. Big play also into financial services, hoping to launch MTN Mobile Money actually in South Africa still in 2019, waiting for a few last regulatory approvals. Thought I would just throw that in with this August audience. Maybe it would speed up a little bit. But no, seriously, I think for us to be a vibrant participant in the modern digital economy, and as we move into the fourth industrial revolution as well, we have to find a way to basically bring everybody into that ecosystem. We see very similar to what you see. We have a wealth of young people that have grown up in the digital age. They can build you an app or a website in a couple of days, but they need access. They need connectivity. They need access to business. They need access to capital. And it's such a vibrant area. And I think we only really will harness that in the right kind of partnership model, because it's a complex thing to arrange. I guess that's what you were kind of saying as well. But what wonderful raw material we've got to work with.
Mark, some people think of mining, of course, as an old line industry, and it is part of the old industrial revolution. But I've seen firsthand how artificial intelligence and automation is playing a role in your industry. How does new technology then, I guess, it creates different types of jobs perhaps for your industry?
I would like to make the point that the products we produce facilitates these new technologies. So we need to remember that mining plays a part in literally every part of the economy. So just plug the industry at least. New technology, from our perspective, is absolutely critical, and it's absolutely critical to our strategy for the industry. In the last 100 years, mining hasn't really changed that much. The gear's got a lot bigger, and as we've increased the size, the incremental returns have incrementally reduced, so the benefits of that sizing is really, it's a law of diminishing returns is the best way to describe it. We believe as a company that we have to fundamentally change the way we mine, the way we process, the way we interface with our communities from a social perspective. It's all part of a very different strategy. In the last 5 years, by just scratching on certain elements and real pinch points in the business, we've doubled the production per person employed in the business. That trend of change has to continue the next 5 years, the next 10 years, and beyond. So from our point of view, the impact that has in our business is quite material, particularly for local communities, because in some cases you require less people. So our commitment that goes with that modernisation, improving productivity, and making sure that we can invest even on a greater scale is to create 5 jobs for every 1 job off-site. So by bringing that infrastructure that I talked about earlier, by working with our local communities and providing infrastructure for new industries to thrive and grow, we then can be a catalyst for new jobs off the new technologies that we're introducing in our business. And so it's a sort of the whole of picture approach, but it's absolutely critical. And I like Rob's analogy of the macro, making sure that the macro regulatory framework is really overhauled to facilitate big change in the industry, and then at the micro level, making sure the detail is done so that we remove the friction from the changes we're trying to introduce. And if I give one example, at Mahanyele-Dabengwa, we're going through the feasibility study, and we're looking at a massive solar power generation system with generating hydrogen, so we can use hydrogen in our trucks, so that we literally produce a carbon neutral mine. And that power and energy is available on a broader basis through the community, but it also provides the infrastructure necessary for all parts of other businesses to actually grow in those communities as well. So I think it's the whole picture, and we have to work at each level, and we have to be talking together, and the government's the key partner, and the local communities are the key partners in making those changes.
We'll get to energy in a moment, but Puti, there's so many new technologies that NASPER is invested in. Can you talk a bit about how that does indeed generate new jobs?
Right. So we're invested in e-tail, as I mentioned before, with Take a Lot and other businesses, and then we also invested in payments and fintech, and we have a number of consumer internet businesses. But what really excites me is seeing what has happened since the last conference. So at the last conference, when we committed the 4.6 billion rand and we set aside 1.4 billion rand towards the foundry, we invested into a business that now employs 15,000 people in South Africa. And, you know, it is so important to be able to support these businesses because they create employment in South Africa on a long-term basis. And so what we've seen is that by being able to invest into a number of these various industries that we are exposed to, that we are able to create so much employment. Over and above that, through our work that we do in what we call the labs. And this is where we are focused on the social requirements in South Africa. We are working with young people and have supported them, focusing significantly on making sure that they are very comfortable with using technology in the workspace. And so having done that, we have been able to put them together with entities such as Udemy, which are other businesses that we're invested in, where they are able to increase their skills, their educational skills, so that when they are in the working place, they're able to, you know, to work in a competitive manner. But we've been able to create significant numbers in terms of employment, and by being able to invest in other businesses, we can continue to do that. And so we look forward to being able to do that in South Africa.
Mark, you just mentioned energy, and particularly in that case, different, a newer source of energy. I kind of want to talk about Eskom. The president talked about the government's plan for Eskom. But as a newcomer to South Africa, I've always found it, that in talking with CEOs, how difficult it must be to make decisions, investment decisions among them, when the electricity supply could be uncertain. So let's talk a bit about sort of how does that affect investment decisions, and how do you see this playing out, the rescue and recovery, if you will, of Eskom? Mark, I'll start with you.
Yeah, there's absolutely no doubt that it plays a very important part in the decisions we make. I've said most recently that it probably represents our single most important risk that we have to deal with. I'd have to say this year, after a difficult start, we've been able to work with the authorities and work around load shedding. But I think it's pretty clear to me, talking to the President, talking to the various ministers, that there's a very clear view on what has to be done. And I think that it is a tough job, knowing that you have to do some fairly significant restructuring, but it is time for us to now take those steps. So we've got to move from knowing what has to be done to doing what has to be done. And I think that the work that is going on now in working with stakeholders, in making sure that everyone understands how important it is and how we go about that process is significant. In our case, we also think that we've got to bring something to the party. So our ideas on the solar energy work, the fact that we've got our global research and development team here based in South Africa working on these ideas and other ideas as part of our own competitive positioning, I think is absolutely critical. But we've got to work with government, we've got to work with communities and find those solutions, but we've got to move on together, and I think it's absolutely critical.
Let me open it up to the panel. Rob?
Yeah, I always have maybe a slightly different perspective on this, because we run 17 mobile networks across Africa, and the only country that is run fundamentally on the national grid is South Africa. 13,000 towers here. If I contrast that with MTN Nigeria, we run 13,000 towers basically on diesel. Yeah. And why that is because South Africa has electrification of almost 90%. So the grid is there, as opposed to less than half of that for the rest of the continent. So we have a very extensive electricity infrastructure in the country. We have installed capacity of, I don't know what, 50,000 megawatts, demand around 30. Again, contrast that with a large economy like Nigeria. 50,000 here would be 13,000 there, and a population that's 4 times the size. So maybe I'm slightly more glass half full than glass half empty, because clearly there are issues. But we have an infrastructure that is still the envy of pretty much any other country on the continent. And I think the challenges now in Eskom are all well identified. Challenges around the energy mix, challenge around stability, gearing, the efforts that the President spoke about of, focusing in the different areas. And it's ultimately now about execution. But it is a very solvable problem in comparison to many of our other, partner markets in the continent that just have an insurmountable task ahead of them.
Teresa, anything you want to add?
Yeah, just real quickly. At AWS, we have a goal of being 100% renewable in all of our regions by 2030. And we have an interim goal of being 80% renewable by 2024. So when we go into anywhere around the world, we look for renewables, and we work with local providers and independent power providers, which is another way to get new startups and create new businesses. So it's really important for us that we are able to work with the government, and that's where regulation and licensing and things, really, we need to expedite that, because for us, if you consolidate data centers and close a lot down that are not energy efficient, that is where actually cloud is a big help, and our goal again is being renewable. So we look forward to working here to make sure that we are supporting the environment as well as working with local providers and be a consumer as a power purchaser of all that renewable energy.
Phuthi, I'm going to give you the last word, but would it be on Eskom or anything else on investment?
What I would say on investment is the fact that South Africa is a very attractive place to invest. As a company, we've been in South Africa for over 100 years. And what we've seen is that we've been able to evolve from being focused on television and the whole media space to being focused on the consumer internet business 12 years ago. And from that, what we've become is the 7th largest consumer internet business in the world. And this all comes from having support in South Africa as a South African business and being able to grow and support South African businesses. We want to continue to do so. We are willing to do so. And that is why we are here.
Thank you all for your insights, and please join me in thanking our panelists.